Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, February 10th, 2026, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. And I'm back here in Brazil. Welcome back, John.
And welcome back to you too, Nima. Thank you for having me.
Please hit the like button, helping us reaching more people. And John, let me jump and start with one of the most important questions and one of the main points that we were talking about it before coming to live is that what exactly was the anchorage formula as referenced by Russian officials? And in what ways do current US sanctioned enforcement measures, such as tanker interceptions, undermine and contradict
Mhm.
Russia's interpretation of that formula? And what is the difference? It seems that the both sides, their perception is somehow different. And what is your understanding of that?
Well, it's a very important new development, so that everybody should understand here. Um, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has declared war on Dmitry Peskov, the president's spokesman. Let me explain how this works. And you've introduced it as the argument over the so-called anchorage formula. The anchorage formula is a slogan that the Russian side has been using. President Putin has repeated it many times, and therefore his spokesman has repeated it many times, as a formula that they allege to have been agreed with President Trump during the Anchorage summit meeting last August. Let's remember, because we did a program about that Trump walked away abruptly halfway through that summit meeting. The summit meeting papers indicated the plan on the US side was for at least 4 hours, a 45-minute press conference, a lunch with an extended delegation, and so forth and so on. Trump walked away, cut it short. This is not part of the formula. What happened, according to my Russian sources, is that President Putin lectured Trump and believed that Trump understood that a variety of Russian concerns, the so-called root causes of conflict that led to the battlefield war that precedes the special military operation. Putin believed Trump agreed, but Trump left quickly. His attention span is not high level. He left quickly. And ever since then, the Russian side, as it dealt with Trump's emissary, particularly Stephen Witkoff, have seen that Trump is the opportunity to make an end of the war in the Ukraine and reopen economic relations, business as usual with the Americans, and to some extent recover from the damage sanctions have done, including the freezing of the central bank's $200 to $300 billion worth of reserves. The formula has factional meaning in Moscow politics, in Kremlin politics. On the one hand, Kirill Dmitriev, the so-called business representative of the president, who negotiates directly with Witkoff, directly with Bessent, directly with other members of the administration. Kirill Dmitriev, Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of the central bank, and business constituents, let's call them the oligarchs for short, have all wanted a shortening of the war, a resumption of US relations. They believe that the deal, and Dmitriev celebrates it in self-advertising tweets, the deal has been done. And indeed, my Russian sources confirm that largely the negotiations with Witkoff and Kushner have resulted in their appearing to accept that Russia has won on the battlefield and that there are a number of ways in which the sides can agree on reopening business relations, stopping the sanctions war, and so forth. That's what they think they've agreed with Witkoff. We can go into more details about what they plan to do. It's essentially privatize the 200x billion worth of central bank reserves, privatize them in a US-Russian fund, which Kushner, Witkoff, and Dmitriev would oversee. Privatizing state property is a rather unusual way of solving a war, but that's what they think they've achieved. At the same time, that is not the view of the General Staff, and it's not the view of Sergei Lavrov, and it's not the view of the intelligence services, and appears not to be the consensus of the Security Council advising the president. They believe the United States wants to get out of a losing war on the battlefield in Ukraine and make a tactical withdrawal so it does not appear to be a retreat, a rout. As they withdraw, they want to reinforce as much of the Ukrainian armed forces as will continue in the future to harass, attack, terrorize, and continue their war against Russia. So conserving them as the US withdraws is a major objective. Conserving European readiness to continue the war against Russia on the other fronts, Poland, Finland, up to the Arctic, northern route, and so forth. That's another US strategic objective, as the Russian side, except for the business representatives, think. Now, what's happened is that for some weeks and months, the foreign ministry has been saying that there is such an escalation of of sanctions against Russia, against Russia's ability to trade its oil and so forth, that the so-called anchorage formula, an agreement on reducing tension and ending war, that formula no longer exists. When a deputy foreign minister said it, he's been corrected by Kremlin. This time, Foreign Minister Lavrov said it as bluntly as it's possible. I'll read it out quickly. And then he was as it were, rejected. The position was rejected by Peskov. I'll read that too. So basically what Lavrov said on February the 9th in an interview in Moscow was that the Trump-Putin meeting in Anchorage told us that the Ukraine problem should be resolved. In Anchorage, we accepted the US proposal. Quote, I'm quoting, if we regard it as gentlemen, it means that they proposed it and we agreed. So the problem must be resolved. So far, and this is where Lavrov declares war, the reality is quite the opposite. New sanctions are imposed. A war against tankers in the open sea is being waged in violation of the UN Convention on the Law of Sea. They are trying to ban India and our other partners from buying cheap, affordable Russian energy. This means the Americans have set themselves the task of achieving economic domination. Furthermore, while they ostensibly make a proposal regarding Ukraine, and we were ready to accept it, now they are not, we do not see any bright future in the economic sphere either. The Americans want to take control of all the routes for providing the world's leading countries of all continents with energy resources. And it goes on. Now, this he said on February the 9th. And TASS reports, I'm looking down, I'm shuffling papers so that I can give our audience exact quotes. Peskov says to TASS, and he calls them in, remember. He doesn't just suddenly say something. He's responding to what Lavrov says. The spirit of Anchorage, says Peskov, speaking for the president, reflects a set of mutual understandings between Russia and the United States that are capable of bringing about a breakthrough, including in the settlement between Moscow and Kiev. There is a whole range of understandings that were reached in Anchorage, which were already discussed even before Anchorage, during Mr. Witkoff's visit here. And it was after this that the need for a summit meeting arose. These understandings achieved in Anchorage are fundamental, and it's these understandings that can move the settlement process forward and allow for a breakthrough. He then refused to go into the details, answering your question, what the hell is the Anchorage formula? Now that's faction fighting. It's as clear as day. Let me go back to what Russian sources tell me is the behavior of Witkoff and Kushner in the negotiating room, as happened in Abu Dhabi recently. But they report this is how Witkoff behaves in Moscow as well. They regard Witkoff as extremely crude, very arrogant. They regard Kushner as somebody who almost never says anything. Kushner behaves as if Witkoff is a father figure. He's there to symbolize Trump's presence, but he does no negotiating, no talking. That's odd for those who are sitting in the room watching the two of them. But Witkoff is in fact obsessed with the notion of a projecting military force, projecting military power, US power that's decisive. He's therefore confident at all times that he and his military can enforce a settlement, as they believe they have done in Gaza, as they believe they could do in Iran, as he believes that they have done in Venezuela, could do in Cuba, and so forth and so on. But in the Ukraine, as we saw in Abu Dhabi this time, there had to be senior military officers. General Alexis Grinkevich, the commander of the European Command, was to the right of the table, the American delegation, if you look at it. And on the far left, General Adamski, I believe, the head of J2, the intelligence, military intelligence for the European Command. In other words, military officers were talking to the Admiral Kostyakov, General Fomin, and General Zorin on the Russian side, and the Ukrainian military figures, including the Chief of Staff Gnatov. What has happened here is that Dmitriev's confidence that Witkoff can be bribed, that the Trump family can be bribed, that the huge billion-dollar deals, including with Russian reserves, can generate returns for the Trump family, returns for the Witkoff family, and so forth. That these lures are in fact achieving economic coordination between the two. They do not want any form of resistance, especially not at sea. They are absolutely determined to block any conflict, clash between Russian forces and American forces. Now, as you point out, as Lavrov pointed out, as clear as day, as the Americans have been negotiating a tactical withdrawal from the Ukrainian battlefield because they are losing and they want to conserve their forces from total capitulation and destruction, the Americans have been escalating at sea. So they're attacking every single major sea route. They seized the Russian flag vessel, the Marinera, was reflagged as it sailed off the coast of Scotland near Iceland. They are expanding in the Baltic through Estonia, Poland, and Germany. They've expanded in the Central Atlantic off the coast of France. They've expanded and aggressively in the Danish Straits through Denmark. We've seen them, and we've talked about all of these incidents attacks off the coast of Crete in the Mediterranean. Russian vessels have been sunk, so-called sabotage off the coast of Algeria at the end of 2024. And I'm not even including the war at sea in the Black Sea. So what we have, including the most recent seizure of vessels, is what Lavrov's called piracy. Now, piracy happens when vessels are not Russian flagged, but increasingly the 1,500 tanker fleet, or between 1,300 and 1,500 Russian oil tankers, not all working for Russia. Only about 15% of them are Russian flagged, but the speed at which Russian flagging has occurred is now accelerating. The question then becomes, and it's a fraught question, a controversial question in Moscow right now, what can the Russian Navy, what can the Russian Air Force, what will the commander-in-chief agree to do to defend this fleet from US attack? And you can very well understand when Lavrov says this level of attack on our vessels, on our trade, whether it's flagged or not, it's still Russian trade, is an escalation that has nothing to do with, violates whatever understanding was reached in Anchorage. So now they're having an argument. And in December, Admiral Moiseev, Alexander Moiseev, the Russian naval commander, wrote a piece, published a piece in a military magazine, Military Thought it's called in English, arguing that you must have Russian naval protection for the trade to keep the trade routes open. Now, that's easier said for the Arctic route because there's a Russian shore, there are Russian bases. It's not so easy to project Russian naval power far off Russian shores where the US have bases. And we've just seen a major interception and seizure of a vessel, not a Russian flag vessel, in the Indian Ocean. The Americans, for the time being, keeping it secret. It appears to have been in the Western Indian Ocean. And it takes a lot of effort for the US Navy and its shore bases, Singapore, Diego Garcia, and elsewhere, to mount these operations. However, it's clear it's a war against Russia at sea. It's clear it's got economic target. And it's clear that Dmitriev and that faction in Moscow have nothing to add to the defense. And they don't want their, as it were, business as usual doctrine to be undermined if there's a clash between Russian naval support for Russian flagged vessels. Now, years ago, I wrote a book about Sovcomflot. The book's called Sovcomplot, published 2023. It's very difficult to have gotten President Putin then to make the decisions that are required to run one of the world's largest fleets, as Sovcomflot was then. Now it's sanctioned. It's very difficult to run that fleet without controversy, without faction fighting, without corruption. Was very difficult then without war. Now we're at war, and the Sovcomflot fleet is a major Russian defense of its trade. And it's very difficult in Moscow terms to get President Putin to decide not only how Sovcomflot should function, that's been half decided by, as it were, keeping the fleet in the dark. Now that doesn't work. You can't have the Russian Navy defend unflagged vessels. The Russian Navy must defend Russian flagged vessels. And we discussed this in an earlier program. But to reflag the fleet and then to deploy Russian Navy means a serious military problem, and for the Dmitriev faction, a serious challenge to their power. So, Sergei Lavrov has thrown down a gauntlet. We must defend. And that means the Navy, the Air Force, and it means lots of things. Shore alliances, shore alliance with India for the Indian Ocean, shore alliance with China for the Pacific, and so on and so forth. There are huge strategic problems to be solved here, military and technical problems to be solved, and Dmitriev's opposed to it. He thinks Vitkov and he made a deal. Vitkov, on the other hand, enjoys this projection of power, supports this projection of power. And so we're not quite as close to a peace treaty, an end of war, as some folks want to say, even if the Ukrainian military capitulated on that battlefield.
John, I was wondering how all of what you've mentioned is serious and is important to be considered, I think, not only for Russia, but for all the countries. I'm talking
Yeah.
about Iran and the Middle East and maybe China as well. And how do these US tanker seizures and maritime interdictions escalate the conflict with Russia or somehow with other countries as well and reshape global perception of US naval power? Do you think that after all these countries all they have they will come together, or there's somehow they would go after some sort of solution for what's going on? Because after all, the United States, it seems to me that they want to dominate everything, but how is that going to be perceived by other countries?
Well, each country is going to have to look to its own interests. Yes. And we've just seen a very significant division, disagreement surfaced by Yuri Ushakov after the telephone or video conference that was held between President Putin and the Chinese President Xi Jinping last week. And in that readout from Ushakov, we see disagreement. The words used, and it's unusual to see Ushakov produce a readout of a conference call with President Xi. I'm just shuffling papers to get the words, because it repeats the Russian disclosure, let's say, that Lavrov disclosed last December, when Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, came to Moscow and met with the Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu and Foreign Minister Lavrov. What was said indicates that there are significant points of difference, that the two sides' positions overlapped, closely coordinated, didn't quite agree, but the points of disagreement have not been identified. And the Russian side have chosen, please, if everybody wants to dispute this, I'll produce the papers, but because we don't have very much time, I'll just scoot over the exact words. There was a disclosure by the Russian side that there is a point of disagreement that's important for the Russian side to surface. Lavrov did it in December. Ushakov just did it last week. So, coming back to your question, we don't know what that point of disagreement is, and the Chinese readouts are so empty of information as not to admit even what the Russian side has admitted. Is there a concern between the two sides, for example, on preserving the oil trade, the seaborne trade that carries Russian goods, not only energy goods, to China, in the event that the United States starts to try to intercept and stop that trade? For the time being, and we said it a long time back, when Trump actually relieved China of the of the Rosneft Lukoil sanction that was introduced last year. Trump enforced it against India, relieved it against China. Okay, but what if it changed? We would expect it would be normal for the Russian side and the Chinese side at the level of Security Council, level of Navy, at the level of senior officials, and then kicked up to the summit to be discussing how to coordinate shore action to facilitate defense against these US-based driven interceptions at sea. We know that, for example, the Marinera required a US base practicing interception on Scottish shore with the British. We don't know exactly what US base was used to intercept the Aquila 2, which was the most recent interception. What we must understand now is for Admiral Moiseyev's strategy of, pardon me, Russian Navy protection in convoy, air overflights, naval escorts. You need shore bases, okay? Shore bases in the Indian Ocean means India. Shore bases in the Pacific means China. Our shore bases in the Arctic, that's Russian. That's less of a problem. Our shore bases in the Baltic, less of a problem. Shore bases in the Black Sea, less of a problem. But there's clearly a need now for coordination between Russia and India and between Russia and China. Is that one of the points of disagreement with China? We don't know, but I'm making it public because the Russian side's made it public, except it isn't seen to have been made public. Now, the Indian side, during the Putin-Modi summit meetings in Delhi in December, and we talked about it then, have agreed to a variety of coordinated deployments so that Indian military can use Russian ports and vice versa. US have similar relationships with Pakistan for the Indian Ocean. They use Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They have bases all the way to the east in Singapore. So we know that Trump is enforcing the so-called promise of Prime Minister Modi that India will cut its oil imports from Russia. And the Indians are indeed reducing and will reduce over time. On the other hand, there have been vessel interceptions, allegedly in relation to Iranian oil movement off Mumbai, off the coast of India, in the last few days and hours. So what we have to assume what must be happening is the three allies, India, China, and Russia, in support of their allies, including Iran, in support of the oil trade that's vital to all three, must be negotiating naval cooperation to protect these convoys, these trade routes, these straits, Gibraltar, Malacca, Danish Straits, the Dardanelles, and so forth. They must cooperate. And do they disagree? Is everyone wanting to make their own deal with the United States? We don't know yet. That's why we're discussing it. That's why it isn't quite such good news from podcast terms. And that's why there's an argument in Moscow right
now. Do you think that the United States, by imposing these sort of sanctions and the behavior that we are witnessing from the Trump administration, they could bring some sort of tensions between the country, between Russia and China, particularly? How do you see that?
I have to say, I don't know yet. It remains to be seen. what we have seen, pardon me, is that each country has been subject, and this is a US trade strategy, to discriminatory tariffs designed to make them choose out of their interest, economic interest, to act against their political alliances. I mean, this is stated policy. It's an understandable strategy. It's not a peacemaking strategy at all, but it is an understandable strategy, whether one understands it from Trump's tweets and speeches, or one understands it from the academic type papers that Elbridge Colby at the Pentagon produces. So in trying to split China from Russia, split India from Russia, that's US strategy. And this warfare at sea is one of the ways the US thinks will be effective. And when Witkoff goes into the negotiating room in Abu Dhabi, he thinks it will be effective. And his military companions, their army or air force, in Grinkevich's case, are not there as naval advisors. Admiral Brad Cooper of CENTCOM was in the Oman negotiations with Witkoff and Kushner and the Iranian delegation. The use of naval power is now, for the first time, a global operation by the US, and with Venezuela, Iran, and Russia as targets. So it's bound to trigger differences of opinion. In India, I know a little bit more about the factional differences there than I know about China. You know more about the factional differences in Iran. What can we say about them all, including Russia? Well, there are those who think it's best to make a deal with the United States now, relieve the pressure now, serve our voters, our business constituents now, resume business as usual. We can all wait out Trump. Indians might think that, the Chinese might think that, Russians might think that. But in the meantime, and whether he attempts a third term, whether Vance replaces him prematurely, who knows? The point is, there are factions who support making a deal now for fear of worse, call them the pro-Americans in each country, and those who say, no, if you make a deal now, Trump will up the ante. That's the way he behaves. That's how gangsters enforce extortion schemes on the street, in the city. This is how they do business. If we act weak and defenseless now, they will escalate. So there's a, let's call it, anti-American faction. And there are military advisors and expertise, economic advisors and expertise assisting each faction in each place, in Iran, in Moscow, in Beijing, and in Delhi. And each one is, let's call it, has a respectable, arguable case. And we're dealing, all of us are dealing with the highly unpredictable situation in Washington. Who knows whether one of the Trump gang, Howard Lutnick, Commerce Secretary, a man who hates Russia, China, India. He hates them. He insults them. He speaks like a gangster who's determined to use his power against the enemies, Iran, China, Venezuela, Cuba, and so on. Well, right now, he may be forced out of government because he turns out to be a liar on his relations, business relations, other relations with Jeffrey Epstein. One gangster removed from the Trump gang would be one less enemy from a global point of view. But it won't change the underlying problem that each of these capitals and political lineups have to decide. Do we make a deal now? Do we resist because they will retreat if we resist effectively? What do we do? And I think it's a very important thing for the podcast audience to understand is that it's not easy to decide what's to be done. Second, the threat of violence, of loss of life is serious, impending, immediate. And when one's responsible, not only to voters, but to one's moral conscience for the lives of one's people, one doesn't make these decisions easily. And one can't dismiss the American side as militarily incompetent or amateurs or fools or arrogant power projectionists fluffing feathers, etc., etc. No, no, no. This is a serious war. It's a war at sea. It's a war on many battlefields against sophisticated people and seriously damaging weapons. And it's understandable that in each capital, there are factions. And to describe them as faction fighting is probably true because the stakes are so serious and urgent. But that doesn't mean that anyone doesn't respect the argument of the other side. I'm trying to say, in answer to your question, that yes, there's tension everywhere because of this. And it's not easy to predict how each state will decide. And therefore, from a Russian point of view, it's necessary quickly to shore up, discuss, reach agreement on tactics, on operations, on strategy as quickly as possible and as secretly as possible.
John, it's somehow amazing to me to see the United States using its full capacity. Donald Trump is using 100% of their power to put pressure on all of these countries: Russia, China, India, Iran. But in response, you don't see that much coming out of these countries. They don't use that. They don't behave the same way that the Trump administration is behaving. Do you think it's somehow a fundamental sort of a strategy difference in their strategy, or the attitude on the part of the United States is totally different from the attitude on the part of these eastern countries? Let's put it this way: is
Yes.
two different strategy. How do you see that? Because I really believe if the all these countries come together and do, no, we know that they have their, their domestic interests, their, national interests, all of these difficulties to understand each other, their differences, putting
Mhm.
all that aside. Is that gonna Do you see that happening if the Trump administration continues with the same sort of strategy, or we're gonna see the same sort of behavior? They're not gonna go that far to put pressure on the United States under the Trump administration. I'm talking about all these countries: Russia, China, India, Iran, and even some countries in the Middle East.
I don't know the answer, Nima. Not in general. Um, I can speak to the Russian side. Why don't you begin by saying what you see in Iran? There is a faction that wants a deal on the terms Witkoff and Kushner are offering. And there's a faction that says you can't believe a man like Witkoff. It's a deception. Let's start, if you don't mind, tell me how you see Iran deciding, and then I can tell you how I think the Russian side thinks.
Yeah. Right now, I think the perception on the part of the Iranian decision maker is that, so what can we do with the current situation with the Trump administration? Are we going to go to war? War is one of the options. The Trump administration, they decide to attack Iran, and we have to respond to that. So what else can we do? As the foreign minister of Iran, Abbas Araghchi, said, don't care to the intelligence, to the military, to all factions of the decision makers in Iran. They said, don't care about what we are doing with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Do whatever you see as your priority to respond to the United States, to whatever would happen. We cannot believe that the United States is faithful in the way that they're trying to negotiate with us. But we have to do this. We are the arms of diplomacy in Iran. We would talk with them. We would negotiate with them. But on the other hand, all the other factions should be prepared for any other option that the country may decide to go with. This is the perception, as far as I know, in Iran.
Okay.
And but I think what's important, how the Iranian government can connect the difficulties they're facing to the difficulties that Russia is facing, to the difficulties that China is facing, that India is facing. That's important, in my opinion.
I think that's well said. Let me see if I can respond. Um, on the one hand, to go back to where we've discussed it, and you've discussed it with Mohammad Marandi and others, I think we have reached a consensus that in military terms, the United States does not dare attack Iran now. There's a kind of stable, temporary balance of power at the brink, at the precipice. That's a no war situation that keeps Iran tense on the defense, keeps the Americans expensively deployed, but not in the attack, keeps the Israelis frustrated, and keeps the Arab states nervous. And that's, in a certain sense, the longer it goes on, positive for the government in Iran, and to some extent for the people of Iran who see the defense working for the time being. Stable, but at the brink. It's a strategy of brinkmanship on both sides. The Russian side believes correctly that it is winning at great cost to Russian lives and wealth of the battle for the Ukraine, for the Donbass, for the 4 regions, for the, let's say, capitulation of the military regime, the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev, to go on making war against Russia. From a military point of view, political point of view, from a popular voter point of view, the army has or is winning. I did a piece in Dances with Bears last week reporting the latest Russian popular opinion polls, and folks who want to know more, have a look at Dances with Bears, and the poll story, I think, appeared last Thursday. Russian voters think negotiations are very essential to reach an end to this destructive war. But if negotiations don't work, the Russian people want effective, swift, decisive action to destroy the enemy. And they understand that potentially means, it potentially means a direct clash between the Russian forces and the United States. They understand the risks involved. The voter sentiment is for negotiations, and if negotiations fail, swift and decisive action, not delay, not temporizing. Politicians, however, have, as we've just described, the view that Russia should avoid direct clash with the United States. And the war at sea poses, if the Russian fleets become convoyed with the Russian Navy, direct clash with the United States. What will happen? Um, this isn't really publicly discussed yet much in the Russian press. In one or two pieces, uh, almost all of the pieces I've seen, both the public discussions, the military bloggers, the Vzglyad discussions, all say Russia must defend the Russian flagged fleet. Therefore, the Russian trade must be increasingly Russian flagged. Therefore, the Navy must be deployed. But what's the sentiment if this produces a clash between the United States and Russia, rather far away from the Russian shore? For the North Atlantic, for example, or in the Mediterranean, for example, or in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, what would happen? Clearly, those who advocate the anchorage formula don't want any form of increased risk of confrontation. The Naval Admiral Moiseev and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, are publicly in favor of defending, because they believe the US side will do what they're doing in the Sea of Oman, standing and not attacking. And what do we see your side doing? The Iranian side is testing Russian, US flagged vessels passing through Hormuz. They send a couple of speedboats out to test the US reaction. They send a surveillance drone over to see, does the US open fire? What do the US do? There's a constant process of testing. For the time being, there's no such process of testing by the Russian side. There was a submarine and a corvette escorting the Marinera, but at a distance and too far away to intercept or threaten the US seizure of that tanker off the coast of Scotland and off the coast of Iceland. As a convoy protection, it was too late, too ineffective. Well, what kind of new test will the Russian Navy and the President and the Security Council authorize? And if they begin to authorize testing like the IRGC is testing at the Gulf of Hormuz, what will be the US reaction? I don't know. Will the US reaction be tactical withdrawal where they can't be sure of overwhelming victory? That's their doctrine. That's their behavior. That's the pattern. But until the Russian side puts up a significant deterrent naval and air force around the Russian flag, all the US side thinks is the Russians are weak. The Russians are withdrawing. The Russians are going to lose their capacity to trade. And your question was, well, you've explained the way the Iranian side thinks. We go to the question of the big consumers of Iranian oil, Russian oil, which are China and India and some other states. What are China and India going to do to reduce tension like this, increase the capacity of both sides to achieve a balance at sea, a non-violent balance at sea, mutual assured destruction at sea? I think the Chinese are far from telling us. The Indian side does a lot more clarification, but this is such a serious and new situation. I don't see yet any clarity from Delhi. So that's summing up. I don't know what happens next. I can only predict that everybody must test the waters, so to speak.
John, how is the tone? How is the atmosphere in Europe because Macron said that Europe will be swept away in 5 years if it doesn't do something. He's talking about the Greenland and the case of the Greenland and
Yes.
how the Europe is responding to the Trump administration. You see most of the countries in Europe somehow bowing to what Donald Trump is asking for. And but where is Europe in the whole, in the case of some sort of resistance against the United States and the way that they're behaving toward Europe?
I don't see Europe resisting, not Western Europe. I see each individual figure, Starmer, Macron, Meloni, Merz, trying to stay in power and making whatever statements they think at this particular point in time helps them with their domestic constituents. Macron's talking at his domestic constituents. Um, he's not really talking at the United States, and he certainly hasn't managed to even arrange the telephone conversation he's been discussing and planning with President Putin for weeks now. No, Macron, Starmer, Merz, Meloni, they all talk at their domestic constituents because they're politically weak, very weak. They are, there's no, there may be the appearance of resistance. For example, Starmer might say that the British decision on restoring the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, that includes the US base agreement for Diego Garcia, is a better solution, while Trump accuses Starmer of doing something, I believe Trump's word was stupid. Starmer will defend his decision, not because he can convince Trump, but because he needs to support his failing prime ministry, which is now in desperate trouble, and he is in personal desperation to save himself as his principal staff members leave his office. He will say things that he thinks necessary to keep himself in power. And we could go from the Netherlands to France to Italy to Germany to see the same pattern, different issues, common political weakness. Why we even see in Poland the prime minister accusing Epstein of having been a Russian agent. I mean, inventing and fabricating all sorts of things. Everybody's trying to conserve power, and I would read their statements as only antagonistic to the US if they think that is necessary for domestic support. But they're not seriously capable of opposing the US on Greenland. We've discussed this before. It would seem to me that Mark Rutte, the former Dutch prime minister, as NATO secretary general, has worked out a formula for Greenland to stay constitutionally where it is, an autonomous region of Denmark, while the United States can expand in the Cyprus model, but with enlarged base areas that will be US territory, as the British base areas are British territory in Cyprus. I don't see any significant effort beyond PR to oppose Trump's final formula for Greenland. And certainly NATO will click its heels, salute, and do what the United States wants, from Finland through the Scandinavian countries into the Arctic and into Greenland, and across Greenland, across the Arctic Circle to Canada. So we see the Prime Minister of Canada putting up what he appears to be a Canadian sovereignty defense against Trump. Trump escalates, Carney defends, Carney depends on a narrow election margin, and had won his place in the party and then his place in the prime ministry as a defender of Canadian sovereignty. But that's not quite the way he behaves. So,
Yeah. I think Canada is facing something that everyone was talking about it before, because they're so much dependent on the United States. They have been so much dependent on the United States. That's why I think their main problem is that, and they cannot move away from the United States. Do you think that's happening? That is going on? That is one of the main strategies in the mind of those people who are running, who are somehow the decision makers in Canada.
Canada can do a great deal to defend its independence, and Carney isn't doing those things. Better to have a Canadian expert on, not me. But Carney convinced me when he was running to replace Trudeau in the Liberal Party, and convinced me when he was running for election that he would defend Canadian sovereignty, the Canadian economy, that he would not subordinate the Canadian military as it's been totally subordinated, first to the United States, then to the Ukraine uh, during the deputy prime ministership of Chrystia Freeland, a Ukrainian. Carney gave all the signals that Canada has the capacity to defend its independence. And he was elected on that platform. And I have to say that he failed. He convinced me that he had deceived the electorate and deceived me, and that he puts his own business interests, which are very linked to the United States, in the forefront of the way he thinks about how to negotiate both trade and political relations with the Trump administration. The irony of the situation is that he would be far more subservient to the United States if the Trump administration wasn't continually upping the ante against him. The Trump administration are making an honest man out of Carney. That's ironical, but as I say, better to have a Canadian expert. There are lots of good ones on instead of me. To answer your question, what could Canada do? What could Carney do that would protect Canada's independence from being attacked by the United States right now? I believe that there's a practical strategy, and it's not being adopted by Mark Carney.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Let's see what happens until next week.
Exactly. See you soon.